Hello folks, in this video I'm going to explain how to animate sprites in PyGame. So in the previous video for this I showed how to create a class for extracting images from a sprite sheet, and this is the sheet that I was working with. It was a sprite sheet for a little dinosaur animation, and it had the idle, running, jumping and all sorts of animations in it. So if I run this code from last time, you'll see I got as far as using that code to essentially allow me to quickly and easily extract individual frames from that entire sprite sheet and then save them as these variables for my images. So if you haven't watched that video, I'll put a link to it in the description. You kind of need to watch that one first to follow along with what's going on here. So to animate these, essentially all I need to do is repeat what I've already done, which is extract the individual frames and then just loop through them really quickly. So at the moment, I'm loading them into frame 0, 1, 2, and 3, and then down here, I'm using the blit function to put them out onto the screen. So I'm putting them at different x coordinates here, x and y, which is why they're kind of appearing side by side instead of on top of each other. So what I actually want to do is only have one blit. So I only want to be showing this dinosaur in one position. It's just that I want to be changing the image that I'm going to be showing. And if I do it quickly enough, then it's going to look like an animation. So to start doing that, rather than loading it in as individual image variables, I need to create a list, and I'm going to store each of these images within that list. So I'll start off down here. I'll add a comment to say create animation list, and I'll call this animation underscore list, and I'll make it a blank list to start with. I then need to define the number of steps in this animation. So for now, I'm only going to extract the idle animation. I'll come to the rest of it later, but I'll build it up in steps. So I'll say animation steps equals 4, because if we go back into this image, this entire sprite sheet, the first 4 are for idle. After that, it moves into the running animation. So now with that done, I can replace all of this code and just have one single line. So I'll loop through this. I will say for x in range animation steps, and now I just extract the images, but rather than doing it one at a time, I have a loop to do it for me. So I can delete this entire bit, indent that, and delete all of the ones underneath. So this line of code, if you remember from the previous video, it loads in, it calls the sprite sheet instance, which I've created above, and it calls in the getImage method, which is part of this sprite sheet class, and then returns a frame. So this first argument here is the frame. Now by default here, I've got it set to 0, but of course if I'm looping through and I'm looking for the different animation steps, this is going to go 0, 1, 2, 3. So this x variable here within my for loop is actually the frame that I want from the animation. So I replace that 0 with an x. And then I need to add this to my animation list. So I just say here, animation underscore list dot append, and put that in brackets. So now it's going to be running this method here, extracting that image, returning it back to me, and then appending it to this animation list. So by the end of this loop, I'm going to have 4 still images, which are the first 4 frames of that animation. Now, just to demonstrate that it's all working correctly, before I actually start to scroll through them, I will replace this section with my animation list. I'll repeat the code pretty much exactly the same. I'll say for x in range animation steps, and then I only need one of these now, so it's screen.blit, and instead of frame 0, well, it's now taken it from the animation list, and it's going to be at index x. So it's going to start off at 0, but then as it loops through, it'll go 0, 1, 2, 3. And the only thing I want to change here is the x coordinate. And now this can be multiplied. So my x here is going to be increasing with each iteration. So I'll say x multiplied by 72, which is the width of one of these images once it's been scaled up. If I run this now, you can see it's giving me the exact same result as before, more or less. And it's the individual stills from the animation, or from that sprite sheet. So I can see that I've replaced this correctly and the list is working. Now all I need to do is actually override, rather than drawing them in line with each other, I need to draw them all in the same place, and I need to draw them one at a time. So I need some kind of timer to allow me to do this. So I'll define this timer at the top where I'm creating my animation list. And this is going to be my variable called last update. and I will use pygame.time.get_ticks. So this is just going to take a stamp of where I am, essentially what time this initially starts to run at. So this is going to take the time of when I execute this code to begin with. I also need some kind of cooldown, so how quickly my animation is going to run. So let's say animation underscore cooldown, and I'll just set this to, this is going to be in milliseconds, so I'll set this to 500 milliseconds, which is half a second. It's probably going to be too slow, but I just want to illustrate using that first of all. I also need to be able to track which frame of the animation I'm in. So here I was using my for loop, but that's not actually what I'm going to be doing because I have a timer for it instead. So another variable is going to be frame. And I will set frame to 0 because I want the animation to start in the very first frame. So now I can get rid of this for loop because I'm no longer looping through this. I'm only showing the animation from that particular frame. So let's replace that with frame, and I will just set this back to 0 so it's showing it in the top left corner. So if I run this code now, I'm not going to get an animation, but I'm just going to get one sprite, and it's the first frame from this sprite sheet. It's this guy here. So now I wanted to run through each one of these one at a time. Well, I've created my timer, so what I want to be doing next is checking how much time has elapsed since then. So let's add a comment here to say update animation. And here I want to measure, or I want to get the current time. So I have the last update, which is when the game was initially run, and that's when the frames in the animation were last updated. Now I need the current time. So I'll say current underscore time equals pygame.time.getTicks. And now I can simply compare that to the last update. So I'll say if current time minus the last update is greater than, let's say equal, or whoops, equal to, done the wrong way around, greater than or equal to animation cooldown, then I want to move on to the next frame. So I'll increase frame by 1. So what this is basically saying is if animation cooldown, remember, is 500 milliseconds. So if 500 milliseconds have passed between the last update and the current time, then we can increase the frame to the next one. So we can move on to the next stage in the animation. Of course, that means that we have updated, therefore the last update needs to change. Last update becomes current time, and that in effect resets the cooldown. So now I have to wait another 500 milliseconds before we can run this again. So let's run the code. And if you keep an eye on it, you can see that it does a little animation. So you can see he runs through each of the 4 frames. Now it does give me an error, and the reason for that error is because I am continuing to increase this frame variable here with each iteration. But of course, it's trying to access the animations from that list at that frame. And that list only has 4 frames in it. So when this variable gets too high, it spits out an error saying that animation list is now out of bounds. We don't have any more frames to go onto. So what I need to be doing is when I get to the very last frame, I need to reset back to 0. And I can do that within this section here. All I need to do is just check whether the number of frames, or the frame that I want to move on to, is greater than the length of that entire list. Because if I'm trying to access a frame that doesn't exist in this list anymore, well then I've come to the end of the list and I can reset back to 0. Say if frame is greater than or equal to the length of this list, animation underscore list. If it is, then let's reset back to 0. Frame equals 0. So run this again, and he goes through and he resets back to start. So you can see it was quite slow deliberately so that it you can kind of see the frames one by one. But if I change this to 100 milliseconds and run it now, it idles and it's actually a lot more smooth now. Can maybe go a little bit slower than that. Let's go 75 milliseconds. And there you go. You got a little animation going on there now. So this is fine, but this only really works for one animation set. So if I was to change the length, for example, and say I want to include the running animation, then if I was to put that in here, I believe that's got another 6 frames. So if I was to just make this 10 and run this code as is, then it will just loop through both of the animations. That's maybe too fast to see. So let's make this 250. So it just loops to the idle one, then the running one, then back to the idle one, because all of the images are still stored in the same list. So what I need is a way of separating these animations into their own sublists. So I sort of need a master list, which is this animation list, but within that, I want little groups of lists, which are my individual animation steps. And that's what I need to do next. So first of all, I can't use this variable on its own anymore because I don't have a limited number of animation steps. Each animation has its own number of steps. So this is the first thing that changes to a list. And the steps are, I've already checked them previously, so there's 4 in idle, 6 in running, then there's 3 in jump, and I can't remember what the fourth one is, but there's 4 frames in that one as well. So I guess we'll see when we run this. But on top of this, I also need to track which of these animations the dinosaur is going through. So I'm going to have a variable called action. I mean, you can call this whatever you like, but I'm going to set this to a variable called action, and action is essentially going to say what action is the dinosaur carrying out. So action 0 is idle, 1 is running. What is happening afterwards? 3 is jumping. I think 4 might be hurt. You can't see it here, but I think that's what 4 is when he gets hurt. So by changing this action variable within the code, I can then access the different animations from this master animation list. So now this for loop is going to become a little bit more complicated. Initially, I was only looping through my animations list because there was only one of them. It was just a single variable, but now it's going to return a number from here. So I can't really iterate through this as it is at the moment. I need to have a loop inside a loop. So I need nested for loops. So I will change this. And now I'm going to say for animation in, and I can remove this because I'm not really looking for a range anymore. I'm just saying for animation and animation steps, which is meaning go through this list here and iterate through each of these values one by one. Within that, I need to then have a second loop. So the second loop is going to be for, and I don't need to track the variable. So I'm just going to say underscore in range animation. So I'm kind of adding an extra step. So this is what I had previously, essentially. I was running through the animation, which is a number at the time, it was a variable. But now, because it's a variable within a list, I need to iterate through that entire list first of all, pick out each individual number, and then repeat what I was doing previously. So the logic that's going to go on here is that I will load in exactly as I was before, each animation one by one, but I don't really need to keep that as a permanent list. So I'm going to create a temporary list for each of these animations. And at the end of each iteration, I will add that temporary list into my master animation list. So within this, every time I come to go through a new animation step, I need to reset my temporary list. So I'll say temporary underscore image underscore list is an empty list. So if there was one there before, it's now emptied out. And now when I load in each individual image, rather than adding it straight into the master animation list, I put it into this temporary image list. Temporary image list. So that way, oops, what have I done here? Just deleted those brackets. So that way, when this entire for loop is complete, it is created, or sorry, it's loaded in the steps that I need for one animation set, and then it's saved them all within this temporary list. So when that's complete, I know that I've grabbed 4 images, for example, from the idle animation, so I can add all 4 of those, which is now a temporary list, into the master list. So here we say animation underscore list dot append temporary image list. So this is nearly complete now. This for loop within a for loop is basically extracting all the images that I want from the sprite sheet. However, remember that first argument here within this getImage method was the frame within the animation sprite sheet that I'm at. So I was using the X variable before because I was able to just loop through a number of steps. But now I can't really do that anymore because this for loop is going to keep resetting itself for each of these ranges. And then the master animation list, well, that's not really going to track anything either. So I actually need a counter so that as long as this for loop is running, every time I pull a getImage method, I increase the counter by 1 and I move on to the next image within this ribbon of sprites. So I need to replace this with a counter. So up here, I'm going to add a new variable called step underscore counter, and I'll set this to 0 because that's where I start off. And then instead of X here, I replace that with step counter. And then as soon as I've loaded an image, I increment step counter by 1. Okay, so that was quite a bit of typing and it's maybe a little bit confusing. So I'll just do a quick summary of what I've done here. So basically, first of all, I have an overall for loop, which is looping through this list here. And this list here is telling me how many frames are within each animation in this sequence. So there's 4 within the idle animation, then there's 6 within the running one, and so on. So that's what that's telling me here. So for the first loop, it's going to go for animation, which is going to be 4, because that's the first one I'm taking. Create a temporary list, which has got nothing in it, and then iterate 4 times, because that's the number that I've just pulled from there. When I'm iterating 4 times, I pull the image from the sprite sheet using this step counter variable. So that's going to begin at 0 and it's going to be increased every iteration. So by the end of this stage here, I have a temporary list which houses the first 4 steps of the animation, or the first 4 frames, and the step counter is increased. So then when I've done that, I take that temporary list and I add it to my overall list, which is where all of the animations are going to be. Then I go through my next iteration, I pull this number 6 because that's the next one in line, and I just do the same thing again. So I go through 6 times pulling the next 6 images, because now my step counter hasn't been reset. So I keep counting from where I was before. So when I got these first 4, my next iteration keeps counting and gets the next 6. And then at the end of that, I have another temporary list. So I add that one onto my existing animation list. So at the end of all this, I end up with an animation list, which in fact, can I just print this out and then that will maybe explain it better. So I'll get an error a little bit further down, but it should print out just enough. Yeah, okay, so that's kind of worked. So you can see I've got 2 square brackets at the beginning, meaning that I've got a list within a list. So this is my master animation list, and then inside it, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 images within a sublist, which is my first 4 steps of the animation. And then it just repeats. I then have another 6 and another 3 and another 4. Okay, so let's remove this. Now that this is done, the reason I was getting an error is because I still have this section here, which is trying to blit the animation list images. But of course now I can't access an individual image from that list because it's a master list. So first of all, I need to tell it which of these sections I'm in, which of these sublists I want to access, and that's based on this action variable here. So that means that I need to add another index here, and it's going to be action. So then I'm telling this the section that I want to go into my animation list. I want to go into the actions. So action 0, for example, is my idle animations, and then access the frame from that. So if I run this again, he's now doing the idle animation. But if I change this action to 1, he's now doing the running animation. So the action is controlling which animation he's doing based on this animation list, because it holds all of them based on this index. So a couple of extra things I want to add. First of all, if I change this to 1 and I run through the animations, you can see he's just looping through the running animation. I want to be able to change these within the code so I can actually flip between animations. So if we come down here, first of all, I need to change this little bit here to avoid any errors, because now it's checking for the length of the animation list, which is not the number of frames. To access the number of frames, I need to go into the particular action that I'm on. That's going to tell me how many frames there are. On its own, line animation list is just telling me how many actions or how many different types of animation there are. So that could be a mismatch and that could give me an error. But to change the animation that I want, I can just add a little bit into this event handler here. So I'll just add an extra set of events for button presses. So I'll say if event.type is PyGame.keyDown. So if a key on the keyboard has been pressed, then I can look for different types. So if event.key is PyGame.k_down and action is greater than 0, then we can reduce the action by 1. So basically I want to use the up and down keys to switch what action or animation I'm doing. And I need to reset it back to the start of the animation. So I'll set frame to 0. Then I'll copy this, do the same thing again, but this time for the up key. So if I'm pressing up, oops, K up, and action now needs to be, I don't want to go beyond what's in my list. So I need to make sure that I don't actually have, that I have enough animations within this list. So animation list -1. As long as it's less than that, then I say my action is increased by 1. And if I run this again, I'm going to start off with idle. When I press the up key on my keyboard, you see it starts running. Press it again, and it goes into the kick animation. And again, it goes into the heart animation. I can't keep pressing up because I've got this check here. So it's not letting me go past the number of animations I have. But I can start pressing down and go back into the idle, go up into the running, and back into the idle. And in fact, let's speed that up again. I just did that to demonstrate it, but I can run it a bit quicker than that. There you go. So now he's doing the idle, now he's running, kicking really, really quickly and getting hurt. So that's pretty much all there is to it. You can add as many animations as you want, or as many as your sprite sheet has, and then you can control them with this type of action variable, which lets you store the animations within a bigger list. So I hope that was helpful, and thanks for watching.